Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdarchist Dave, and tonight I'm joined by
Nerdarchist Ted. How are you doing this fine and lovely evening, sir?
I'm doing good. We are here to talk about Desolate Wastes and Dungeons and Dragons. Let us jump into Desolate Wastelands, Aether Skies.
When we're looking at Aether Skies and you take the concept of desolate wastes, there's a lot to really unpack, even though, like, when you think the term waste, you think like this expansive landscape. But with the skies, it's a skyscape that you're mostly dealing with. So it kind of has to take another twist on, word usage.
Well, so here's the thing. The thing with Aether Skies is something a long time ago really bad happened. So bad that everyone fled the surface world. And, peeling back the curtain a little bit, like, we know when the 13 cities were risen through the use of magic and ether fight, they created a seal that locked away eldritch horrors that were trying to infiltrate this world. And the cities themselves kind of make up the sigils and the seals. But in addition to that, what else happened, right? So, we've played a little with, the surface world being explored, and, the game starts off with, it's just a really bad place, and expeditions down there don't last very long, and they only go down for short times. And when they do, they try to be off the surface before nightfall, because that's when the really bad things happen. So yes, there's a skyscape, but the skyscape is actually kind of the safe space where the desolate wasteland is everything on the ground, right? Now, it may not necessarily be the same as what you think of as a wasteland when you're thinking of deserts and marshes and things of that nature, which all of those could be on the surface, of course, because, it's a world like any other. But the biggest problem in Aether Skies with the surface is the fact that it's kind of been overrun by monsters, right? Like that is the reoccurring theme and story that comes back. Horrible things come out at night, take away the people that live there or murder them.
Well, if anything I've seen from movies, if there are monsters and we have to fight them, shouldn't we go get aliens?
Well, you could try that, but I'm not sure if that's going to work out in the long run, because then I think you're just going to have to fight aliens after you fight the monsters.
But joking aside, you're absolutely right. But it's not just, monsters. You have to look at what happens when you remove the people element from nature. Nature does what it wants. So, I imagine, there are grandiose, plants that are just as much a hazard as a bulking monster that might be, lurking under the ground and what have you. You could have things that are, absolutely warped by, the energies of, these eldritch beings that have, subtly leaked power through these gaps that have managed to happen over the years. So here's where you could take all of your monstrosities and aberrations, come up with, hordes of new ones and just be like, all right, well, you know what? This is my version of what a squirrel used to be, and now it's something else. And over here, this is a horrible death cat and whatever. Come up with all of these great things to just terrorize people, knowing full well that there's not a check you can make. Because once you step down, off that ether ship and you're on the ground, you don't know anything about what's there. There's no setting up a defense. There's no, oh, it's a troll, I have to use fire. Because even if somebody knew something from 10 years ago, that might be old news. That might be, now an advantage to said creature who's had, generations of growth to take something that was its weakness and now turn it into a strength.
Well, as Jeff Goldblum said in Jurassic Park, life will always find a way. And
life will way.
And so, you guys have played in Aether Skies and you've actually experienced some of that. There were things living on the surface that weren't necessarily hostile, and they came up with their own mechanisms for, surviving, what is, an eldritch horror wasteland, right? Like that's the real problem, is that there's so many monsters, and things that wouldn't have been monsters before have been corrupted to the point where they might as well be monsters. The two underlying themes in Aether Skies when it comes to the world itself is corruption and hostile magic, right? Like, and the fact that the hostile magic also is kind of the thing that sustains the cities, right? So it's this give and take. And, when you guys actually went to the surface, you encountered, several different things. You found things that were actually friendly. There was two different groups that, figured out ways to survive. You found, like, for, lack of a better description, they were basically like miniature stone giants, or maybe intelligent stone golems.
Right.
And they were monks that were cloistered in a monastery, and there weren't many of them left, and they've been dwindling, and they just been kind of hunkered down, trying to preserve what lore they have of old, some of the old religions. That was one of the things you encountered. The other, and then there was another group of creatures that were kind of living their best, like, Ewok life, that when you fled into the forest, these creatures actually found a way to survive the forest. And not only that, keep out some of the more hostile creatures, corrupted creatures. There was definitely a hive mind, a psionic baboon creature. I may have drawn some inspiration from the Sioux monster from first and second edition of Dungeons and Dragons.
Sure.
They're also kind of like grouped. They don't have a very large vocabulary, and all they would say was Zach, and which was funny because, well, it was funny to me anyway, because one of the players' names was Chris. And he kept saying, "Are they saying my name?" I'm like, "No, your name's Krizik. They're saying Krizak." It's completely different. You guys ended up having to flee these creatures into this forest.
They whooped us up pretty hard from what I remember.
Yeah, psychic monkeys are a pain in the ass. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? And you guys only explored a tiny bit of the world too, right? Like, it was an arboreal halfling society that you guys were actually kind of, I think, rescued, maybe captured by for a little bit, until you guys were able to befriend them, and they actually kind of assisted you and helped you guys kind of heal up, and it kind of set you on a path, which was like an old road that led to what you guys were looking for your goal. But, like, those were the only two things that you guys found on the surface world that weren't completely hostile towards you immediately.
Else, like, would take away from the concept of the wasteland. And it's always good to be able to put role-playing encounters in places where you think only hazards and combat are going to exist. And that's one of the great things about GMing, is to be like, oh, look, I'm going to put this here and shock my players. But at the same time, you can't always expect it, because then it's expected, and it's not a surprise. So
finding the balance.
Right. Finding the perfect balance is what you need to be able to do. But you also have resources down here. So, like, beyond the fact that there's meat, whether it's edible or not, to transport it back to cities, but there are, ore that can be mined. There's, lumber that is so precious for flying vessels to just be like, all right, here you're going to get, the most amount of wood easiest if you can survive the landscape to be able to do it. So, like, it's a competition, not only for you to fight off the other things that are there, but the fact that other cities might be sending these scavenger parties down at the same time. So, like, it's almost like a land dispute, because it's like, all right, well, I wanted that tree. Well, so do I. What do you do? How do you handle it?
Yeah, and one of the other things we established is the surface is where criminals get sent. That are beyond rehabilitation. It is almost a death sentence, but not quite.
And this is the thing that when I'm looking at the notes, was the most intriguing to me. My first first birth thought was, all right, that's the game I want. I want to drop my players on the surface. Like, sure, we're playing Aether Skies, but fuck the sky. You gotta survive. Can you make it down here? Can you allies? Can you find shelter
Ted,
can you find a way to sustain yourself? Maybe until you can find a scavenger faction that doesn't go to your city and convince them to take you up or take over their ship or sneak aboard their ship. Like, find a way off. Like, there's so many different options and avenues that death could just be it, but doesn't have to be.
are you saying, Ted, that you can take the skies from?
I can, yeah.
I was also thinking, because last week we were talking about this idea that, well, we're going to make this our own setting and come up with our own things in the future. But for now, as we're playing, it's just easier to use what's already there. And we were talking about, creating, you wanting to play a harem. And I said, well, I don't want to really create a world where every single D&D species necessarily exists, right?
Right.
And so, but I was like, well, what if we kind of did this umbrella of beastkin or beast folk and, they've got some level of corruption to them already, which definitely going to work into a complication for those characters in the game. Both like, I'm thinking like they're going to be able to be more resistant to corruption, but also already start with corruption.
Sure.
So there's a bit of a double-edged sword, but and it's not that you're not going to be a harrigan because there are harrigan that exists, but because, well, that's what the corruption did. It made you a beast-like creature, in this case, a hare or a rabbit. But you could do the same thing for minotaurs, gnolls, bugbears, any of the more monstrous type races or species in D&D, we'll just fold them into that umbrella. Just like I know one of the players wants to play a Warforged, and I'm like, well, you can use the gnome or the Warforged, but you're just going to be a construct, and we'll just use those stats for that. So we come up with something for the setting itself.
And as far as beastkin, like I had a fantastic idea, that helps out the whole concept as a whole. Like, all right, I'm always someone I like to play characters that look different, that stand out. I want to do things that are not like, oh, I get to be a human that walks around all the time. I want to be something that doesn't look like that, doesn't act like that. So I had this concept of like, okay, well, sure, under D&D rules, you can insert this strangely looking race. But when you're looking at, say, a beastkin, like it doesn't necessarily have to be a single animal trait, or it doesn't have to be like a whole cloth. Okay, you want to play a tabaxi looking thing. Well, in D&D, okay, you're a whole cat person. Well, what if you want in Aether Skies? Well, what if I just have, as they do with the costumes, I've got ears and I've got a tail. That's it. Other than that, I look human, but that's what you got. You can go everywhere you want on that spectrum. It's still blatantly obvious to anybody who looks at you. Like, sure, you might be like, okay, well, if I stuff my ears underneath a hat and I put on a coat, you can't see the tail. Okay, now I look human. All right, that's fine. That's a way to hide your complication. But to me, it's a lot of fun to be able to offer up the option to the player base to say, okay, you want to be this thing, but be in full control of your sliding scale, go for it. And like, to me, that makes me, happy to be able to offer that up.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing, beastkin will pilot or whatever you decide to call it will be kind of a spectrum, right? And, but I feel like on the surface, that's where there's going to be more of a concentration of them, and they've adapted to living down there. It could even be that that's what's happened to the folks that weren't able to escape into the skies, right? And in Aether Skies, we have the surface world, but we also have the return city of Haven, which, was knocked out of the sky 100 years ago and then mysteriously returns, shrouded in gloom. And the expeditions that have gone there have not come back, since I've played a couple campaigns with it now, in the campaign that you guys played, you guys kind of ended it by sealing, replacing the seal at the very end, from the surface. My other group, they actually ended up having to go into Haven and fight your characters as NPCs, and then like stop the eldritch horror from coming through and seal it that way. But the city itself is pretty desolate, right? There's nothing there but horrors. And in that campaign, I used what I call dark riders. And it was basically objects that had these psychic beings attached to them and handling handling the objects was how a dark rider would attach to somebody and take them over and just would transform them into these horrendous things. They kind of look like living ghouls.
Okay.
And, and their primary attack was they would shoot their tongue out and it would open up like kind of like a suckerfish, like an algae eater, and attach to people and then begin siphoning off their life force.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you realize what I just reskinned a monster when I made those. So it was basically a mind flayer. And instead of doing their psychic blast, they would do that. It would have like the same effect on the individual, which is a lot of that.
Yeah.
So for Aether Skies, thus far, we have 2 desolate wastelands. One is flying in the city and one is on the surface world. The question is, where will the players want to explore? Will they get stuck? They play in Ted's campaign. They sound like they're just going to be stuck living on the surface, trying to overcome the fauna, but the flora as well. So until next time, stay nerdy.